Introduced to hunting as a teenager, Kelly's life pretty much does revolve around that 24/7. For 23 years, she's been joint owner-operator of Southpaw Outfitters Limited and is actually now, I think, the sole owner and operator of that big game guiding and outfitting service in Alberta. In addition to running the business, Kelly is the executive director of the Hunting for Tomorrow Foundation, a nonprofit organization that she's been heading up since 2001. Hunting for Tomorrow promotes recruitment and retention of hunters, promotes awareness about the contributions of hunting, and fosters a positive image of hunters and hunting. She's also an executive board member of the Alberta Hunter Education Instructors Association and the Conservation Education Wise Foundation. Kelly has served on the board of the Alberta Professional Outfitters Society for 18 years and has served on the board of directors for the Northern Chapter of Safari Club International. She's also an active member of the Alberta Bowhunters Association and a member of the Outdoor Writers of Canada. In addition, when she has a moment or two of spare time, she serves on the board of Wildlife Habitat Canada and the Outdoor Caucus Association of Canada. She's been the recipient of the ITV Women of Vision Award, the Diana Award of the Alberta Hunter Education Instructors Association, the Alva Bear Memorial Award for Conservation Excellence, the Order of the Bighorn Award, and the Pope and Young Club Conservation Award. She can match hunting stories with anybody and enjoys sharing stories and memories of hunts around North America, as well as enjoying the friendships she's established over the past 2 decades in the outfitting business. A few years ago, I had the pleasure of listening to Kelly square off with somebody on CBC radio who we'll classify as an anti, and I've never heard a more complete evisceration of the opposition as the job that she did on that radio that day, and in fact I phoned her to tell her what a great job she did. We've tried to get her here for a few years. Finally the schedule's lined up, so please join me in welcoming Kelly Semple.
Good morning. You know we write that stuff ourselves, right? Sounds great. I should get a copy. I'm going to read that again. So 2 things when Greg asked me to speak. First of all, I'm honored to be here. And the reason our schedules didn't line up is for many years this event was the same time as the Edmonton Boat and Sportsman Show. And that's kind of one of those mandatory things that we have to do. The second thing that happened was a couple weeks ago I was in Michigan and I ran into Shane Mahoney there and he said, "Oh, I'll see you here." And I said, "What day are you speaking?" He said, "I don't know." And I said, "Well, you better check, because if you're speaking on the same day I am, I'm calling Greg and I'm out." So thank goodness for scheduling. So when I was thinking about today's discussion, yesterday Greg said to me, "What are you going to talk about?" And I said, "I have no idea." So then I actually did think about it, so don't be prepared to go to sleep right away. But I really thought about it, and I thought, okay, recruitment and retention, that's what I was asked to speak about. And that's important. We're doing it all the time. So I thought, okay, I have lots of funny stories. I could tell you funny stories. I have lots of statistics. I could tell you statistics. I could tell you about the great programs that we're doing in Alberta. You're doing great programs in Ontario. So I thought I would do a little bit of all of that. But most of all, I want to touch on something that resonates with all of us, and that's the stories of the heart. The stories that if we're able to duplicate them and tell them to others in a meaningful way, we will actually begin to make a difference. Now, my background in hunting, I don't come from a family of hunters. I come from a family that we were fairly poor. We lived on a farm. We raised our own meat. And up until the time my sister was born, who was 5 years younger, one of my main jobs when we butchered the chicken was I was the head cutter off or picker-upper. And so the chickens went on the block, we chopped their head off, and Mom said to me, "Will you pick up their heads?" I was so glad when my sister was finally old enough to get that job, and I was promoted in the organization. I mean, I went on to big things. I think I was a feather plucker or something. So today we are going to talk about recruitment and retention, but it begs the question beyond the recruitment and retention of hunters and anglers. The question becomes who, what, when, and why. When we've spoken about this topic, we generally always focus on hunters. And there's no doubt that many of our programs have made a huge difference in individuals' lives. And I want to tell you a story that's stayed with me for nearly 20 years. A number of years ago, we implemented a program through Hunting for Tomorrow where we had an essay competition, and we took 6 kids bear hunting into a remote wilderness camp. They had to write an essay on why they wanted to go. None of them had any involvement in hunting, and off they went. We picked them up in Edmonton, hauled them 5 hours into the bush, put them in a quad and a tub trailer, hauled them down a muskegee trailer, took them into tent camps, and away they were. And they were great. I mean, they were hilarious. And about the 3rd day, we had a satellite phone, and the mother of one of the kids, his name is Anthony Nardi, and the mother phoned, and she said, I just want to know how Anthony's doing. And I said, he's doing great. She said, is he okay? He's never been away from home. I said, he's fine. She said, okay, can you say hi to him? I said, yep. So I waited. I mean, I have a little bit of sense about teenage boys and how you got to be cool. And so I waited until Anthony was by himself, and I went over and I said, your mom called. She wanted to know if you're doing okay. You doing okay? I said, yeah, I'm doing great. I'm having a great time. I said, okay. So the hunt finished. Anthony wound up shooting a bear. A couple of the kids didn't, but they had a great time. Off they went back to Edmonton. I closed up the camp with the guys, went back to my office. 2 days later, the phone rang, and it was Anthony's mom. And she introduced herself, and I said, oh, how are you doing? She said, good. I need to talk to you about something. And you know what that's like. I'm not a parent, but you know when somebody says, I need to talk to you about something, nothing good can come from that. I said, okay. She said, Anthony came home on Sunday, and he said nothing about the hunt. And his mom said, well, tell me about your trip. He said, I don't want to talk about it. Off he goes to his bedroom. She is thinking the worst possible scenario. The next day, he comes home from school, grabs a Coke, sits down at the table, says, okay, I want to tell you about my hunt. And he is as serious can be. And he looks at his mom and he says to her, the first thing I want you to know is I went to bear camp a boy and I came home a man. In his mind, he had gone through a rite of passage that was so important to him that for 24 hours when he came home, he couldn't verbalize that. He couldn't talk about that. I see that kid every year at the Sportsman Show. There was a time he was shorter than me. He is way taller than me now, but every single year he comes to see me and he says hello and he tells me what's happening in his life, and he tells me many of the stories about how it took them 3 hours to do dishes in bear camp. Yes, it does take kids 3 hours to do dishes, but he tells us stories over and over again. So do our recruitment and retention programs make a difference? You bet they do. In Alberta, we've been very consistent with our recruitment numbers. We're seeing a gradual increase of hunters and anglers. We see an increase in our draw applications. We have people that are better informed. They're more strategic with their draw applications and managing their draw priorities so that they can hunt in different areas at different times. More than 6,000 graduates from our online hunter education program, more than 2,500 people participating in that program at any given time. Nearly 100,000 people will go through our program in a given year, so we're touching a lot of lives. We live in a province with some of the best access to public land. Over 60% of our land is public, and over 1.5 million acres of land is available for recreational hunting. 120,000 hunters, 250,000 anglers. That's nothing compared to what you have in Ontario, but it's significant. Since 1997, we have over 1 million people who have purchased WIN cards, wildlife identification numbers. And so there's some substance, there's some numbers there. Check, covered the numbers. One of the things that happened, which was significant, is the Alberta Conservation Association many years took over the management of the funds, the majority of the funds that came from the hunting and fishing licenses, and they became what's known as a delegated administrative authority. They manage somewhere in the neighborhood of $15 million worth of revenue that comes in from those programs, and they do a good job of it. So for the most part, our mentorship programs are active, they're flourishing, we've got active involvement from both mentors and participants. Volunteerism has never been so high. We have 2,500 people delivering hunter education across the province. It's in every corner of the province. There's a local instructor to teach hunter ed or firearms courses, the National Archery in the Schools program, the Bear Essentials program, you name it, we got it. So we're good, right? Everyone in the conservation arena is doing what they should. Our volunteers are helping at every turn. Money is flowing. Events are happening. Recruitment and retention is alive and well in Alberta. And that concludes a part of my presentation. You can clap if you want to. However, in the broader picture, let's consider what if. Let's rewind the clock. In 1996, under severe financial pressure from our governments and the restraints of looming shortfalls in financial income, can you say 2015 if anyone knows what's happening in Alberta? In 20 years, we have a province that's seen the highs and lows of such fiscal management, it's just unbelievable. From a time where we had money flowing, the government wrote a check for $300 to every man, woman, and child because the surplus was so high, to a point that really should have carried us for decades forward. In January, we predicted a $500 million deficit. In February, the Minister of Finance announced that, it's going to be a $465 million surplus. And in March, we're predicting a deficit again. Critics say we'll have a $16 billion deficit by 2017. That's good news. But I digress. In 1996, the government needed to downsize, and one of the targets was Fish and Wildlife. That was an easy agency. There wasn't going to be a lot of public outcry. 15 staff positions were abolished. The hunter education and the fishing education program were completely decimated. And this was despite the fact that the government had in regulation a requirement that you needed to take the hunter education course in order to hunt in Alberta. Some people in our organization with vision, with forethought, with business acumen, went to the government and said, give it to us. Give us $1 from every license sale, and we'll multiply your efforts, we'll expand the program, we'll make it accessible across the province, and we'll do what you could not do, what you failed to do, what you killed, what you didn't think was important. And we've done that. The National Archery in the Schools program, which I see you're launching here, with 547 teachers. We just hosted the national competition. 1,300 students participated in that. And that's not a hunting program. That's about kids taking up an individual activity that has proven results in terms of scholastic achievements, personal self-confidence, willingness to be involved in an activity that's not considered a group or sport activity, and has seen benefits across the board. We offer the Canadian Firearms Safety course. Our numbers were up 40% last year. We do the Outdoor Women's Program, which is the 21st year that we've hosted that. It's the largest program in North America. We've just launched a new Camo is the new black, and I heard that yesterday. Someone said it, and I'm like, that's ours. So we're doing some cool things. We did some economic impact surveys, so we have some numbers from that. And we try to use those numbers. We know they're important to politicians, and so we do studies, and we just did another outfitting study to find out what the impact of that was. And when I thought about that, I thought, you know what we should be saying? We should be saying that the value of what we do is priceless. You cannot possibly measure it in dollars and cents. And while we need those dollars and cents to talk to politicians, we need to believe. We need to believe, we need to think it, we need to tell it, and we need to understand that that is absolutely priceless. Today, our Fish and Wildlife Agency in Alberta is still under incredible pressure. The budget cuts are looming, and healthcare and education will see major bites. But when I spoke to one of the representatives in Fish and Wildlife, a senior government individual, and I asked him what he was concerned about, he said, I don't think we can possibly be cut anymore. We're absolutely bare bones. How sad is that? Several years ago, our Fish and Wildlife officers were moved out of the realm of Fish and Wildlife Management. They moved to the Solicitor General Department and became officially known as fish cops. And I mean that with no disrespect. I have a great relationship with my personal Fish and Wildlife officer. He stops in at my house for coffee once a month. And the truth of the matter is I flip him most of the information that's coming from government. They don't even report or have a chain of communication with the Fish and Wildlife managers. And they are yet the guys on the ground who are interacting with the hunters and anglers. They are more aware of what's going on than the bureaucrats in Edmonton, and there is no method of communication. They have a complete disconnect with wildlife. Two other significant things happened in 1996. I mentioned the Alberta Conservation Association. The Alberta Professional Outfitters Society was created at that time as well. Both of those, as delegated administrative organizations, had the ability to move the control, the operation, and the mandate away from government and to put it into the hands of people that had a vested interest. At that time, $11 million was moved from the government fund to, which was known as the Wildlife Trust Fund, was moved to the Alberta Conservation Association. Today, that would never happen. How many times would you see $11 million moved from government? The outfitted hunting industry did the same thing. The renewal fees, the license fees went directly to APOS, and again, they continue to manage that. Over $1 million has been put into a wildlife conservation fund that funds everything from studies to academic work to aerial surveys, you name it. Those organizations are flush, they're successful, and they have influence. Wait a minute, though. I'm supposed to talk about recruitment and retention. Got to get back to that. And it is. But I ask you and I challenge you to broaden your thinking beyond recruitment and retention of more hunters and more anglers. We need to recruit more support of the public, the politicians, the media, previous hunters and fishermen, and current hunters and fishermen. Shane said yesterday, politicians don't know and won't care until the public knows. Let me repeat that. Politicians don't know and don't care until the public knows. Does the public know? Are they informed? Do they care? The media sure knows when it's a negative story. They pick up on that all the time. Otherwise, there's little appetite for our news. And some of us make the best food source for them possible. We do, and we see things that are so negative, so distasteful, and that hits the media. And then many of us who it's our job to counteract those, we spend a lot of time doing damage control. And just as we've gained so much, one negative action, down we go. We know that the North American model of conservation exists by no accident. Shane told us that yesterday. In fact, I've heard him tell us that for 13 years. When I first met him at the Premier's conference in Ottawa all those years ago. And interestingly enough, I can't remember what I ate for breakfast yesterday, but I remember many of the things that he spoke at that conference. He said that the organizations have the knowledge and the capacity to lead. He said we need to spend more time talking to other entities rather than ourselves. He said conservation and wildlife is the greatest force of hunting, and we keep hunting so we have wildlife. We stand like no other group has ever and will ever stand for wildlife. And then he asked, what does leadership look like? He said, preach the history to everyone in every way possible, and that we need to understand what wildlife means, why conservation matters, and what we do in its service. We need to be guided by what the absence of wildlife would look like. And he painted a very vivid picture of that. We need to build bigger coalitions that will turn policy into direction. So this discussion is about recruitment and retention of public support. We must weigh the challenge before us and respond to it. We must look back at our successes and see what we did right. And we must look forward and see new approaches and new solutions and new ideas. Many of those are right in front of us. Shane told the story yesterday about landing on Mars. I have a personal one. We can put a man on the moon, but we can't build a bag of flour that won't rip from the time you get it to the vehicle to the house. Really? No one's figured that out? People want in, and sometimes I think we're reluctant to let them in. We are busy fighting small issues that divide us and do nothing to serve our cause. In Alberta, we have a number of hot buttons. We're fighting about whether we should move the sheep regulation to full curl. We're fighting about the native harvest on the Suffield military base and whether the natives should be allowed to shoot elk there. We're fighting about the number of cougars in Alberta. We're fighting about the predator-prey relationship. We're fighting about access for waterfowl. We have so many issues going on, and we live in a land of plenty. But still, we fight about it. I think for most people, the failure to act is not about not wanting to do something, but it's about not knowing what to do. And our job within this room and beyond is to foster that leadership. Use the same principles to recruit public support that we do to recruit hunters and anglers. Create greater support for government. Make government have greater support for wildlife and wild places, not just hunting, but all things wild. Our government's disconnect with wildlife is greater than ever. The odd politician comes out of the closet, but for the most part, they stay in the background. We had a minister of sustainable resource development at the time, a guy by the name of Ted Morton, who was an avid hunter and an avid angler. He was the most influential and most interested minister we've ever had for fish and wildlife. And you know what? He would leave the legislature building and he would take the trek down to the Petroleum Plaza, which is where the ADMs are, and then he'd go across the street to where the managers are, and he'd walk those floors and he'd talk to people. And you know what? The bureaucrats hated him. He gave them so much work to do. He gave them so much stuff to think about. And he moved them out of the drudgery of day-to-day stuff. And you know what? The majority of those guys were glad when he left. The greatest champion we have ever had in Alberta for fish and wildlife, and the people that serve at the pleasure of the public were glad to see him go. I'm embarrassed by that. We just graduated 45 new fish and wildlife officers in Alberta. Not one of them hunts. What does that say about the future? Alberta and Canada is a better place to live because we have wildlife and wild places. We have some of the best hunting opportunities in the world. And at the turn of the century, that era became a benchmark for wildlife management. And I believe that we are again at that point, perhaps more of a crisis than ever. And is the role today of the hunter and angler become irrelevant? Are we focused on issues of consequence? And I spoke about the elk situation at Suffield. A little bit of background on that is for years that base has accumulated a massive amount of elk to a population of 8,500. And to the provincial government's credit, for many years they've been trying to get hunting open on the base, and this past year it was opened up. At the same time when they did that, the base commander invited the First Nations from Treaty 7 and Treaty 8 to come in and participate in the hunt. Well, there's stories galore. As it turns out, the native harvest was about 400 bulls, which if you live in that area and you were trying to get drawn there, the priority was about a 10 or 11, meaning that was how many years to get drawn. And there's some massive bulls. There's some 400-inch class bulls. So the residents were just up in arms about this, that, you know, all the bulls had been shot. So a meeting. We had to have a meeting. So we convened a meeting, and we had all the people there. And we talked about everything that was wrong. And we criticized government, and we criticized the base, and we criticized the natives, and we criticized, I don't think there was anyone left to criticize. And so we talked about that, and then we talked about it some more, and we talked about it some more, and then And then nobody had any solutions. And I said, and it was during the Sportsman show, and I needed to get back, and I stood up and I said, you know what? Until we talk about issues of consequence, until we talk about a plan for 10 years from now and 20 years from now, I'm not interested in talking about what happened a month ago at Suffield. It's like looking up a dead horse's ass. It is dead. And I hope there's no kids left here, sorry. It's still dead, guys. So politically, we need to focus the discussions around sound wildlife management rather than social management. And that's really the key of what's happening in Alberta. We are managing wildlife based on social pressures. We can change that. We need to change it. And I sometimes wonder, and I am amazed when I look at this group, because a lot of you are very young. I see some people with gray hair. I see some people with no hair. I see some people with nicer hair. And I really wish I would have come 5 years ago because I had less gray hair my own self. This is a younger group than what I expected, and I'm encouraged by that. Because we need to press forward. We need to keep asking the questions. We need to listen to the answers, and we need to formulate a plan that will address them. One of the things we're talking about in Alberta is for a long time, we had a multi-stakeholder process that was driven from the organizations and worked its way up. That got a little bit uncomfortable for some of the government people, so they came up with an idea. We're going to have an advisory group. So the advisory group is going to handle stuff, and they're going to bring all the resolutions and regulations down to us. Well, the whole process has changed so much so that we go to the meeting and we listen to what's going forward, and then we write all our notes, and then we go back and tell our groups, and then the regulation changes, and then we complain about it, and then we go to the next meeting. You know what we're going to do? We're going to stop. We're going to stop going to those meetings. And it's going to take all of us, all of those groups, to say, you know what? We're not going to a meeting that says we're going to consult, and we're not asked one question, and our input doesn't matter. And unless we stop being a part of a process that is fundamentally flawed, unless we stand up and say, no, I'm not going to go, and the Sheep Foundation isn't going to go, and the Wild Elk Group isn't going to go, and Fish and Game's not going to go, and the outfitters aren't going to go, none of us will be there until our input matters. And unless we do that, we'll be going to the same meetings for 10 years. I'm not going. Our challenge is to mobilize the forces like we've never done before. Our challenge is to involve the average resident, more to engage the volunteer efforts of the sportsmen, more to ensure that the actions of today leave a legacy of natural wealth for the future. The champions of wildlife will no longer be the great conservationists of the past. Instead, there'll be you, there'll be me, and there'll be the guy or gal down the street. We need a recipe that every person with an interest in wildlife will follow. And a recipe that can be done in every way and in every community. And this may be the greatest think tank that we can convene. And it doesn't have to be at a national level. It doesn't have to be at a provincial level. It needs to be at a community level, with each of you starting to engage people that you know, that you trust, and that no one trusts you. I know I live in a man's world. I often get asked or hear the comment, "You hunt? You don't look like a hunter." And my response is, what does a hunter look like? It's all of us. We're old, we're tall, we're big, we're small, we're lawyers, we're doctors, we're farmers, we're everything. And people need to understand that. We need to be advocates of hunting in all ways. When I get my hair cut, I talk about hunting. When I buy my groceries, I talk about hunting. And if they don't like it, tough. And if they want to learn more about it, then I will engage them and I'll talk about it. My niece is a pretty smart girl, and many years ago I told this story, and it's an interesting one because when I talk about advocates of hunting, I think this is such a great example. So I had some friends who were Edmonton Police Service officers, and they were at a wedding in Calgary. And so, you know how you sit in the pews in the uncomfortable silence when you're sitting beside someone you don't know, and you begin to make some kind of conversation to break the silence. And this guy was sitting beside my two friends, and he said, "Oh, what do you do?" And they said, "Well, we're policemen." "Oh, really? Oh, that's so interesting." And this guy begins to ask a million questions, and suddenly he's fascinated with the fact that they carry firearms. So he wanted to ask about that. And what do you carry? What kind of handguns do you carry? And so, the conversation was going on. And finally, my one friend said, "Well, we mostly carry Glocks." "I love the Glock," he says, right in the middle of the church where it was dead silence. I loved that story. So, of course, I repeated it to my family. My niece, who was 6 years old, was in school in Grand Prairie, and the DARE program came in. So there was a police officer that was there, and he talked about the program. And Danielle was just waiting. She was just waiting to ask her question. And so the guy finished talking about the program, and any questions? Up comes her little hand. And you have to picture her. She's the littlest thing. She's the cutest little thing. And she says to the officer, "What kind of handgun do you carry?" And he said, "Well, we carry a lot of things. My personal favorite is the Glock." "I love the Glock," she says. 2 hours later, bling, my sister gets a call. "Danielle said a very strange statement in school today." My sister said, "What?" Well, she was talking about firearms, and we're wondering what her interest in firearms." "Oh, my sister's an outfitter, and she's in the hunting world. She talks about it a lot." "So is there any reason to be concerned about Danielle's psychological factors?" "No, I think she's good." "Okay." So 3 years later, the same school, same little girl who's a little bit bigger, a little bit more attractive. Social studies, they get into a debate about hunting. Comes Danielle's hand, gets into an avid debate about the value of hunting, why it's important, how we respect animals, the value of taxidermy work in a home, and how it captures the memories of the hunt and tells the story of the hunt. She pretty much won that conversation. A couple hours later, phone rings. Sister answers it. "What is Danielle's relationship with hunting?" "Well, my sister's an outfitter, and she's involved in the hunting world." "Okay, so where does she get all this knowledge about hunting?" My sister said, "I have no idea." And so when Danielle came home that night, my sister said, what was the discussion? She said, "Oh, they're a bunch of idiots. They don't have a clue what's going on." "I told them," she said. "Auntie Kelly's told me. I told them what they needed to know." She's 8. I've never had a direct conversation with her about hunting, yet she could tell the story better than many of us. Many of you have seen the movie Braveheart, and I actually had to look up this quote, but it stuck with me for a long, long time. William Wallace said to Robert the Bruce, "Men don't follow titles, they follow courage. Our people know you, noble and common. They respect you, and if you would just lead them to freedom, they would follow you. And so would I. So to all of you I say, be leaders for wildlife and wild places. Lead others into the battle. Give them tools to fight with. Engage the greatest ground force that we have. Make a difference, because now you must. Wildlife and wild places deserve a secure future." Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I think you can see why for 5 years we've been pestering Kelly and chasing Kelly and harassing Kelly to come and speak here. And I'm
that was about speaking?
I
digress.
That's for later. So we really appreciate that she took the time to come here. You can tell how busy she is from all the hats that she wears, and she's a good friend to us, to the Federation, to me personally, and we're delighted to have her. So thank you very much for being here.
Thanks. Thank you.